Makahanya haramita shingyo Genji Saiboza Gyojinanya haramita jishoken gon Gai gudo esai gu yaku shari shiki fui gu fui.
In a monastery in medieval Japan was an elder monk of whom the younger novices stood in much awe, not because he was severe with them, but because nothing ever seemed to ruffle or upset him. So they found him uncanny and were frightened of him. Eventually they felt they could not bear it any longer, and decided to put him to the test. One dark winter morning, when it was the elder's office to carry votive tea to the founder's hall, the novices ganged up and hid in a corner of the long and winding corridor leading to it. Just as the elder passed, they rushed out, yelling like a horde of fiends. Without faltering one step, the elder walked on quietly, carefully carrying the tea. At the next bend of the corridor stood, as he knew, a little table. He made for it in the dark, laid the tea bowl down, covered it so that no dust could fall into it, but then supported himself against the wall and cried out in shock, "Oh, oh, oh!" A Zen master, telling this story, commented on it. So you see, there is nothing wrong with the emotions, only one must not let them carry one away, or interfere with what one is doing. This is rather a nice story which brings together a number of elements and again takes place in a training monastery, and this time in medieval Japan. And those training methods which were imported from China haven't varied very much. One goes in, this has been said before, it's after one has done one's sort of novitiate, been ordained and done one's novitiate in a training temple, small training temple, one is sort of broken in, then one goes up to the training monastery for a number of years. Could be anything from 1 to 3 to 5 to 13 years, in some cases the rest of one's life, but that's fairly rare. Afterwards, the monks are ordained as priests and then they leave to take up and become incumbents at their own particular temples. So these monks are actually in the training monastery. And in this case, there was an elder monk, so here's somebody who's been in the training for a long time. And the training in those monasteries is pretty severe. The monks have to keep their wits about them. They're really tested, and this is because they are coming into that realization of the wisdom and strength of the Buddha nature. So really a number of things are being developed, a number of abilities are being developed within them according to their nature. One is the ability to develop skillful means to make use of the circumstances around them, and the other is to really come into contact with that energy of life itself. And this reflects the two sides of the Buddha's own insight. In the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, the Mahayana Sutra, it said that when the Buddha attained his enlightenment, he declared how wonderful, how miraculous all beings, but all beings, are fully and completely endowed with the wisdom and the strength of the Tathagata. The Tathagata is another appellation for the Buddha himself. So, in other words, what he was saying is that the Buddha nature, which is inherent in all beings equally and evenly, have the capacity for wisdom and the capacity for great strength. Normally, we're not aware of that, either the wisdom nor the strength particularly. Often I think I know what's going on, but then things happen that show that I'm somewhat ignorant of the circumstances quite a lot of the time. I have my own skewed view, my own perception, but it is partial. It's from my own point of view quite often. But there are times when that wisdom really does become clear. And it's the same with the strength as well. The strength, the energy, or the warmth of heart if we like. Again, that strength is also there, but because it's not an I-based strength, I'm quite often not aware of it. Again, we've covered this before in previous talks. In certain circumstances, however, it will come out. In certain circumstances, usually in an emergency, we find that we're capable of things that ordinarily I'm not really capable of in cold blood. And this is why, well, it's often said that people who are infused with the passions, for example, are quite capable of saying and even of doing things that in cold blood would seem impossible. The classic story of the typical Japanese granny, old lady, bent over, thin as a stick, in the house on her own. The house catches fire. She's just about able to save herself and also drag out the most precious thing in the house, which is, of course, the family chest containing the heirlooms. In the cold, grey light of morning, when the house now is nothing but ashes, because those old houses were made of wood and paper, it takes 4 strong men to pick up that chest and carry it away, which that old lady was able to pull out all by herself. In the cold light of day, even she couldn't move it, not again. So a typical example of suddenly where from that strength suddenly comes from. And of course, quite often in our circumstances, this I'm convinced that I lack the strength, whether it's a physical strength or whether it's a spiritual strength or an emotional strength, for example. And so I cramp up with fear. But the Buddha made it clear in that statement how wonderful, how miraculous all beings have that wisdom and power, that in fact we all have that wisdom and power within us. But alas, as the Buddha went on, because of their sticky attachments, human beings are not aware of it. And so because we're not aware of it, we live in fear. And we seek that strength. We seek it outside of ourselves usually. We only have to go to our local bookshop or look on Amazon under the self-help things, how to get confidence, how to quit smoking, how to lose weight, how to do this, how to do that. We're always looking for the latest techniques, and even mindfulness and meditation have now become methods and techniques for acquiring strength. But the truth of it is that however good the technique, the only thing it can do is really reveal what we already have. There's no way that we can acquire something that we haven't already got. Hence why Master Mummon said that the treasures of the house do not come in through the front gate. Why? Because those treasures are already inside the house. It is simply that we've forgotten that they are there. So our training, spiritual training, is in fact to simply become aware of those things which are already inherent within the body, within the heart. And we remember that the Buddha said in the Pali Canon, in this fathom-long body lies the world, the beginning of the world, the end of the world, and the way that leads to the end of the world. And this is because in Buddhism, Buddhism itself, the matter of Buddhism, is the nature of one's own being, the nature of one's own heart. There's nothing to be acquired from outside, simply to be revealed what is already there. So in those monastic circumstances, in the severity that we encounter in the temple, the strict rules, the way that they're enforced, the way that there's very little time to think about this or that, it doesn't really matter what I think about the job that I'm supposed to be doing, whether I like it or whether I don't like it or whether I want to do it a different way to the one that's been prescribed. We're just expected to get along, go along with it, give ourselves wholeheartedly into it. And what we find is that little bit of pressure bestirs us. There's something comes up. I mean, the common parlance, we call it the second wind. That energy which suddenly appears when I give in a little bit, when I stop insisting on having my own way. I know this myself through the retreats, the sessions, for example. I remember for a long time, quite often that first day at a retreat would seemed to take an age and always seemed rather difficult. And it wasn't until I'd been on quite a few of them that I discovered why. And that is because in the day or two leading up to it, I'd be thinking to myself, oh, why does this retreat have to be happening just now? You know, it's so inconvenient. It's been a long week. I've got various things that need to be done. I now have to postpone them in order to go on to this retreat. How inconvenient. And so inwardly I was resisting that retreat, even though I wanted to go on it, even though I'd paid and booked my holiday from work and all the rest of it. And it always took that first day for that resistance to give in, to give up. And as soon as that resistance had sort of flagged, then suddenly it was as if everything sort of gelled, and the rest of the session would go on. That's not to say that it was always easy. It wasn't. The legs hurt and the back hurt, and there was the various wants and not wants that came up. But somehow, fighting against myself, fighting against my own desire not to be there, made the life there that little bit easier. And these are the sort of things that we discover in those scrapes, in those circumstances. So the training environment has been set up especially to really bring these resistances out and to learn in the middle of them to jump back into it. This is why one useful method that we can employ, even if we are in lay life, is to actually set up a little timetable for ourselves with a time to get up and a time to go to bed. Obviously, if we're working, then that usually sorts most of the day out for us. Obviously, we put our Zazen onto that, our sitting meditation as well. Don't overload it, but just those few things are usually sufficient. And we do that 6 days of the week, and 1 day we have off as well, because this is the middle way, of course. And what we find is that very quickly, once the initial enthusiasm has worn off, then, well, my wants and my not wants soon begin to appear. So, for example, the first morning, the alarm goes off, 7 o'clock, and I jump out of bed, which is what I'm supposed to do. The alarm goes off, I don't think about it before thinking, get straight out of bed. And the second morning, the alarm goes off, same thing, I get straight out of bed. And the third morning, the alarm goes off, and I lie there and think, well, I've done it 2 days already, I don't need to do it a third day. I've already shown I can get out of bed, so I'll just have 10 more minutes. So I hit the snooze button and I turn over. But there's a little nagging voice at the back of my mind that says, now, that's the whole point. I'm supposed to get up as soon as the alarm goes off. And another voice comes in, replies saying, but I've already shown I can do it. Well, one has to keep on doing it, showing that there's consistency in the practice. Oh, for goodness sake, these Zen, these Japanese things, it's so robotic, you know. I can make my own mind up whether or not I want to get out or stay in bed. Well, you did make your mind up. You agreed to do this timetable, and now after 2 days you're wanting to give it up. Now get up. No, I don't. And the feet goes in, and something hot snorts up inside. And of course, I don't get up, and neither can I relax and go and snooze either, because I'm now all cross and hot and bothered. And so finally I drag myself out of bed in a bad mood. And we may sort of think, well, what was the point of that then? You know, devising a timetable in order to cause myself to get all hot and bothered. But it's precisely this locked horns thing, this fact that I set out to do something, I carefully consider a way forward, and having decided to do something, begin to apply myself. And then after a short period of time, after the initial enthusiasm comes off, there comes a time when suddenly I can't be bothered with this anymore. I've had enough. And then what happens? Because that aspiration is still there to want to continue. It's just that it's rather like a seesaw. It's gone down, and then the impulse, this momentary impulse, has come up because the old habits are resurfacing again. What did I expect? And so this is just the sort of horns of the dilemmas that a lot of our situations find. Now, the whole point about having a timetable is that whether I get up or whether I don't get up has no moral consequences whatsoever, and it's not going to be injurious by and large. And so it's a perfectly safe environment within which to really explore this reaction. And more than just exploring it, because it's not a matter of now analysing it to death. That's not what we're about. In the monasteries, the whole thing is to, as quickly as possible, jump into it. It's actually to transcend the whole situation. And of course, going back to that, our one who is now trying to get out of bed, it becomes a real problem, because the following evening I make an absolute vow to myself that I am going to get up when that alarm goes off. But the following morning, it's as if a different person is lying there. That slovenliness does not want to shift itself, and I dig my hooves in. I do not want to get up, and it becomes a real problem. And it frightens me a little bit, because who is this one that suddenly seems to take over? Well, this, of course, is our old friend, the bull. And so there he is. We come back into contact with him. And, of course, this is what we need to do if we're going to work with the bull. Then, of course, first off, we have to come into contact with him. And here he is. So in that case, the timetable can be a very useful method for bringing us into contact with the bull. So now, at this point, having got myself a bit worked up and realised now that there is another one that lives in the own heart, I go to my teacher and say, I thought this training was going to make me better, more disciplined, for example, less encumbered by these things. But in fact, it's making me worse. And the teacher usually at this point says, good, the practice is working. But what should I do? What's the next thing? Well, says the teacher, forget all about trying to get out of bed on time. When the alarm goes off. Because as soon as that thought comes up, it creates an equal and opposite reaction in the bull. And you're just going to fall straight back into that duality, straight fall into that horns of the dilemma. So the best thing is just the following night, when going to bed, just go to bed, set the alarm as normal for the time that has already been prearranged. And when the alarm goes off, instead of thinking about getting out of bed, simply reach for the bed covers and as quickly as possible throw them off yourself and continue lying there as long as you want. So now what happens? That alarm goes off, and yes, I grab the covers, and instead and using that with that physical jerk, notice that it's the physical movement itself. The covers are thrown off, and lying there in a cool room, and maybe if I need to, I can always open a window to make sure it's not too warm. Suddenly that sort of warm, comfortable nest that's so appealing has vanished. And as soon as it's vanished, then 3/4 of the desire has already gone away. The next thing then, as quickly as possible, without thinking, before thinking about it, to stand up and take a few steps away from the bed. Being upright like that, in that the physical movement itself overcomes the strength of the desire. And usually by the time I've got to the door of the bedroom, most of that desire now will have already be dissolving away. And we're off. And this is what we do. This is the importance of that real jumping into it. So this is the discipline. The discipline means the consistency, learning to be consistent. And of course, the more we do that, then what we find subsequently is that the old habit of hitting the snooze button and lying there becomes superseded by a new habit now. The interesting thing about this is, of course, that the preferences still remain. I remember hearing Soka Morinaga Roshi giving a teisho once, and he made it quite clear. He said, do not be fooled into thinking that I enjoy getting up at 3:30 in the morning, which is when he does in the summer. He says, I don't. But the point is, it's not a problem to do so. And that's the big thing. This is really what that strength is. In Buddhism, the liberation comes from the fact that the strength is there to be able to bear the circumstances that I don't particularly like. They're no longer problematical. I no longer have to hide from them. I no longer have to manipulate people and circumstances in order to evade them. I don't become anxious about them. The strength is there that if it's coming, then it comes. To take it to its extreme, if you like, Master Nyuri, in The Ceasing of Notions, a text that comes from the Dunhuan caves, says in one place, he says, if a bull elephant comes charging at you, if you can, get out of the way. If you can't get out of the way, then stand your ground. If you can't stand your ground and bear it, then shout out, cry out. But of course I don't want to cry out. But Master Nyuri is saying, well, that's what we go through. I mean, if we can bear it, we bear it. And if we can grit our teeth, we can grit our teeth. And if we can't bear it, then we cry out. I make that a problem because I judge that as something that is horrible and I cannot bear. But what Master Nyuri is pointing to, what the Buddha is pointing to, is that there is a strength that can. And it's this strength that's really being cultivated. And in someone in whom that strength has been cultivated, we often think, oh, that person has great strength, and we admire them, but they frighten us too, because what we sense is not so much the person, but the strength. We can sense that strength within such a one, and it worries us. I don't like it. I don't like people who have more strength than me. They frighten me, because they make me feel small, and I don't like to feel small. And so that's why these monks felt this way about this elder monk. Nothing seemed to ruffle him ever. He always had that composure. And so we can fall into that error of thinking that on the inside it's smooth, always smooth. Literally that he's floating along on 6 inches above the ground on a cloud of unknowing. There could be earthquakes and volcanoes erupting, and he just sort of floats through the whole lot. But actually there's something rather inhuman about that. Such a one doesn't feel, such a one doesn't have the problems and trials and tribulations, the difficulties of his fellow human beings or her fellow human beings. And such a one now has become distant. And considering that the Buddha was full of compassion, and compassion means suffering with, then even the Buddha himself had to be able to feel the suffering in order to feel compassion. In the story of Kisa Gotami, a well-known story, of a woman who lost her child, the Buddha was deeply moved by her plight, deeply felt it, her suffering as his own, and was thus moved to help her, to do something about it. That's what compassion obviously is. So this story, here we have them, the monks ganging up. And in the morning, and this is so, in the shrine room, before the chanting takes place, tea is served to the Buddha and to the ancestors as well. And it was obviously this monk's job to do so. And of course, they get up very early, and it's probably either winter, so it would still be dark. And so it has to be done in the dark. But he knows the corridor so well, he can navigate his way through safely. But those monks can also hide. And they leap out like a horde of fiends, yelling at him. And it says, without faltering one step, the elder walked on quietly. So that outer form there, here we have that strong outer form, which has been cultivated and cultivated and cultivated one step at a time, has now become really solid and has become a container. And once we have that discipline, then actually we can relax. we can relax into it. I remember being told of an interview with an Orthodox Jewish man, and the interviewer said, you have so many rules that you have to follow that govern every aspect of your daily life. I can't remember how many, but it was several hundred. Don't you find that they are a bind, that they're so restrictive on you? Don't you resent them? And the Orthodox Jew laughed and said, no, not at all, he said, because I know perfectly well that as long as I stay within those rules, I can do whatever I like. Quite a different attitude. Normally, if I have even a little rule, I can get resentful about it. I've seen it at temples, where people have to leave their shoes in one place and put some slippers on, and some people really don't like doing that. I don't want to wear someone else's slippers. Make a hullabaloo about it. I mean, a huge thing, and wobble all over the place. Well, we don't have to. If I feel very insecure, then, of course, these small things can upset me. But I feel insecure because I feel that the strength isn't there. So, out of that long practice, his strength is there. But, on the other hand, and this is what this is making clear, is that he goes round the corner, puts the teacup down, places the dust cover on top of it, leans himself up against the wall, and that reaction comes out. Oh my God, that terrified me. And this is what the Zen master commenting here. The Zen master is actually Venerable Myokyo-ni's first teacher. It was Master Sesso who said this. Telling this story, he commented on it. So you see, there is nothing wrong with the emotions. And this is important because sometimes in this practice, there comes a point, because we know we're working with the fires, and we're told about working with the fires, the transformative element, the transformative agent in the practice, which are the fires, the passions, the emotions themselves, which is why we must come into contact with them. It's very easy to fall into thinking that somehow they are the enemy, rather like the bull is the enemy, and somehow he's got to be put in his place. And of course, he can't be put in his place. The bull is to be gentled, but actually, it's the herdsman who's also going to be gentled as well in that too. The emotions come up because I am there, and so in the laying down of I, in the softening up of I, then the bull, in that process, the bull becomes gentled. Only, he says, this is the Master Sesso, one must not let them carry one away. So there's nothing wrong with that. There's a lovely story of another Zen master who was in the habit of taking an evening stroll around the local village nearby his monastery, and he was a highly respected figure in the community, Lord High Abbot. And as he was walking through the village one evening, he heard crying coming from one of the houses, and so he quietly entered and found a group of people who were of mourners around a coffin. One of the old grandfather had died, and so the mourners were there paying their respect, and the master knelt down at the back of the room quietly and joined in, and a few tears were shed by him too. And at one point, one of the members of the family turned and saw who was there. His Eminence was there, and said quite urgently to him, said, But I thought a person such as yourself would be above such things. And the Lord High Abbot, wiping his cheeks, said, It is because I can do this that I am above such things. You may think that's rather a strange response, but the point is, in those circumstances it was fitting. When someone dies, or when we lose something precious to us, or someone precious to us, it's natural to be upset. But it's that being carried away by it that's the nub. And this is why Master Hakuin said to laugh, but not to be carried away by laughter, to cry, but not to be carried away by tears. So we must not let them carry one away or interfere with what one is doing. And this is, of course, what's learnt through the discipline. With the discipline, We can feel whatever we jolly well please. And I can think whatever I jolly well like. But just do not let it spill over. Do not let it interfere with the discipline practice, with the Shila practice. That continues. This is why we have the precepts. You know, I may want to murder you. I may want to steal your stuff because I feel it rightfully belongs to me and because I'm jealous and whatever. That's perfectly okay. That's just karma. But the important thing that it does not spill over into action. Because in doing that, then we create further karmic seeds, damaging and unskillful karmic seeds, which will have further consequences in the future. Okay, well, we'll leave it there for now.
Boji so aga anya shin